and namaskar. And I want to thank Professor Navin Sharma, who invited me and has been extremely helpful in arranging this program. I'd also like to thank Professor Nikaran Singh, who also has been very helpful to me, and I'd like to thank the Vice Chancellor Tripathi for his kind introduction and agreeing to serve as the chair. Thank you for bestowing this honor of inviting me to deliver this lecture, and I look forward to your questions, comments, disagreements, and lively discussion after my presentation. I've been to India many times, and for many years, I've seen more of India than I have of the United States, and I have visited so many Indian universities, but I was not familiar with the Indira Gandhi National Tribal University. After receiving your invitation, I looked into your university, and I was delighted to learn that your mission is very similar to my values and commitments, my research and teaching priorities, and how I live my life. I'll divide my presentation into 5 parts. I'll provide introduction, then secondly, 4 approaches today to Gandhi, which I'll say make him largely irrelevant. Third, I'll talk about Gandhi's approach to philosophy in focusing on the primacy of practice. Fourth, I'll try to provide a brief formulation of the nature of Gandhi's philosophy. And finally, I'll reach the conclusion why Gandhi is not only relevant today, but is in fact more relevant than ever for Gandhi 150 and for the future of India and the world. So I'll submit that M.K. Gandhi remains the most admired person in India, but he is controversial and he is interpreted in contradictory ways. I shall discuss how 4 classifications of interpreters in India regard Gandhi in ways that make him irrelevant. I shall maintain that Gandhi's values, teachings, practices, and messages are more relevant and desperately needed today than ever before in confronting issues of violence, hatred, class exploitation, and inequality, gender and racial and ethnic and religious oppression, immorality, untruthfulness, and environmental unsustainability. But Gandhi is so relevant only if we reinterpret and reapply his message selectively, rejecting what is reactionary and irrelevant, reformulating Gandhi's legacy in ways that are contextually relevant today, and integrating Gandhian perspectives with complementary non-Gandhian, tribal, Adivasi, indigenous, Dalit, untouchable, socialist, feminist, environmental, and other contributions. A brief describing a little of my into India may be interesting to you and will help to frame my presentation on how we can approach Gandhi, his philosophy, and his practices today. I was very fortunate at a young age, 21, and then mainly 22 years old, 1963, 1964. Immediately after receiving my bachelor's degree, I was in India on a special Fulbright. I was assigned to Banaras Hindu University, where I taught one upper-level English course, and I mainly immersed myself in postgraduate PhD courses in Indian philosophy. I also got to immerse myself in Benares, in Varanasi, at a very different time. I was very fortunate. We thought that Benares would never change. We would go for a week without seeing even one automobile or one Westerner. Every day we would go to the Ganga, to the Ghats. We would immerse ourselves in the music and the art and the culture, the religion, the philosophy. I got to meet remarkable yogis and pandits and sadhus and others, and at a very young, formative age. So it was very fortunate, and at Banaras Hindu University, which was probably the #1 philosophy department in all of India, dominated by followers of Shankara, Advaitins, traditional Vedantists. My main teacher was T.R.V. Murthy, and he was a famous Indian philosopher, had written a famous book on Madhyamaka philosophy, Buddhism, Nagarjuna. He was a South Indian high Brahmin, very devout and follower of Shankara. And he was the president of the All India Philosophical Congress that year. And I became very close to Professor Murthy and others in the department. And what is very interesting is, although the presence of Gandhi was everywhere at that time, all the politicians, the vice chancellor, influential figures, they would all wear their Gandhi caps, their khadi, and they would always say, in the words of the Mahatma, and they would have certain rituals they would go through. But in the entire year of my studying most advanced Indian philosophy, the name Gandhi was never mentioned once. We studied Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, Madhva, Nagarjuna, all the ancient philosophers, Radhakrishnan, and many 20th century philosophers. But Gandhi was considered irrelevant to philosophy. So the profound influence that Gandhi had on me was in terms of civil rights. I left India, went immediately to the South, which was segregated. I was for 3 years there, very involved in the civil rights movement. The major figure was Martin Luther King Jr. I learned you could not understand King without understanding the major influence of Gandhi on King. And then Gandhi was so influential in my anti-war work with the Vietnam Indochina War, my anti-apartheid work, and all of my peace and justice activism continuing to the present day. But Gandhi was not a philosopher. All of this changed in the 1990s. I recognized that Gandhi was not an academic philosopher, not a philosopher in any disciplinary way, but in fact, Gandhi was philosophically more significant than what was being done in 95% of academic philosophy. So since then, since the 1990s, I have focused greatly on Gandhi's philosophy. As was mentioned, I've written about 5 books with a Gandhi focus. The most recent was entitled Gandhi After 9/11, Creative Nonviolence and Sustainability. And that was published last year, 2019, by Oxford University Press. So I have tried to show how, in fact, Gandhi does have a philosophy and why it, in fact, is extremely significant and for us today. So now what I'd like to do is simply present what I've considered four current approaches to Gandhi that, in my view, make him irrelevant. The first one, surprisingly, is the approach in India of many dedicated Gandhian devotees in Gandhi ashrams and other interpreters who admire, extol, and sometimes even deify the Mahatma. For them, Gandhi is the saintly, perfected, exemplary Mahatma, and his writings and teachings are the scriptures, providing us with all of the solutions for our personal and worldly problems. Unfortunately, as was the case during his lifetime, and as remains true today, Gandhi is regarded by these admirers as too good for this world. And we continue to ignore his perfect teachings and practices, resulting in our anti-Gandhian world. Secondly, there is a wide variety of diverse anti-Gandhian critics who also present a very rigid, absolute, decontextualized Gandhi. However, for these anti-Gandhians, Gandhi's so-called perfect solution is no solution at all. At best, Gandhi was well-intentioned, but naive and unrealistic. At worst, he was and remains complicit with and part of the problem of caste oppression, class exploitation, gender and ethnic oppression, and much more. And he and his philosophy are obstacles to progress. Third, there are the economically and politically powerful modern Indians who Gandhi identifies with, quote, modern civilization, unquote, in Hind Swaraj and other works. These are non-Gandhian and anti-Gandhian expressions of the corporate and financial capitalist elite. Scientists and engineers and medical experts, those promoting fossil fuels and military and nuclear domination, and those with the power shaping mass media and the dominant culture. Today, these modern human beings identify with neoliberal corporate capitalism, profit maximization, globalization, ego-driven materialism and consumerism, worship of technology, militarism, and multidimensional forms of violence, and the domination of nature. For them and their worldview, Gandhi is irrelevant. Fourth, there are leading political and economic figures, political parties, and many other influential Indians who now extol Gandhi as an exceptional Indian, as a great Hindu. But they use Gandhi to justify their anti-Gandhian values, policies, and goals. In the past, and I can say this from many personal experiences, many of these same Indian leaders and groups viciously attacked Gandhi as a traitor, an enemy of Hindu India, who weakened Indians, who was responsible for partition in Kashmir, who preferred Muslims over Hindus, and much more. Today, on Gandhiji's birthday and other occasions, they extol the Mahatma, but they use this ideologically to deflect attention away from their extreme anti-Gandhian, violent, intolerant, divisive, political, economic, military, nuclear, and other priorities, values, policies, and objectives. So I want to give you the contrast to that, how I approach Gandhi and why he is so relevant. So I would say third, in terms of Gandhi's approach to philosophy, Gandhi does always focus on the primacy of practice. He is not concerned with abstract, detached philosophy. He is concerned with philosophy as lived. Philosophy as lived. And there's a common misconception, namely that Gandhi was a very practical person, and he was not concerned with philosophical concepts or thoughts. That's a misconception. So, Gandhi does focus on the primacy of practice. You have to deal, and this is his major focus, on the real world in which we live. The world of intolerance, immorality, untruth, violence, oppression, exploitation, suffering. Gandhi starts with practice, and then our thoughts, our concepts, our ideas, our philosophy must arise from practice, right? And in fact, thoughts, ideas are essential. We don't have good practice without them. Thoughts, ideas, concepts serve as guides to action. In other words, this is philosophy as action-oriented. Philosophy as active, dynamic, relational, and transformative. But what Gandhi says then, such philosophy, our ideas, our thoughts, they must always return to practice. They are not simply some detached abstract theory, but in fact, we must apply all of our ideas and thoughts to new practice. In terms of the title of Gandhi gave for his autobiography, this philosophy is in terms of experiments with truth. And the only way we know whether our ideas and theories are true or false is, in fact, to apply them to practice, to test them. And Gandhi himself has hundreds of passages where he talks about his failed experiments with truth. He had ideas, he had theories, he tested them, and often they were failed experiments. And Gandhi says you can learn from your failures, right, in terms of new practices and how you reformulate your new philosophical ideas. So fourth, let me pay some attention to Gandhi's view of philosophy and how this informs Gandhi's epistemology, his theory of knowledge. It informs Gandhi's ethics. And in my approach, Gandhi is primarily an ethicist, a moralist. Gandhi is primarily concerned that students and others live virtuous lives, lives of character, right? And that this is for Gandhi what is most important, in fact, whether in fact we live morally or not, whether we engage in disciplined, non-egoistic, selfless service to meet the needs of suffering of others who suffer. This is how we live a moral and spiritual life. And Gandhi's view of philosophy also informs his ontology, an ontology he has, which is often ignored, which is he has a basic view of reality, of truth and reality. So let me say that Gandhi has in his philosophy a holistic, organic view of the interconnectedness, the interrelatedness of all of life. Gandhi has a view of the oneness of reality, the basic unity of reality, that what unites us at the most basic level is more fundamental than what divides us. But in Gandhi's view, towards others, as opposed to much of traditional Vedanta and other Indian philosophy, as well as much of Western philosophy, he does not devalue the status of others in terms of epistemology, in terms of knowledge, ontology. We don't simply dismiss the other as illusion, as unreal, because everything is one. For Gandhi, we affirm our basic unity, our oneness of reality, but with a respect for legitimate differences. Others have different ways of doing philosophy, of approaching truth and reality, of acting morally. And so Gandhi wants to affirm in his philosophy a unity with, though, a basic respect for the other. And in fact, we can learn from others who have certain truths that we don't have. So in Gandhi's approach to philosophy, there are in thousands of pages, he affirms there are two key foundational concepts: satya, truth, and ahimsa, nonviolence. And there are many other concepts you can start with in Gandhi because everything is interrelated. You could begin with satyagraha, swaraj, swadeshi, sarvodaya, the construct concepts in the constructive program, and you can show how they're all interconnected. But for Gandhi, the most important foundational concepts are satya and ahimsa. So let me mention again this very briefly necessarily. For Gandhi, satya, the way he uses this, truth, he derives this from sat, the Sanskrit sat, what exists, what is being, what is real. So for Gandhi, satya is, he says, truth, which he uses interchangeably in different passages. Truth with being, what is permanent underneath the world of impermanence, what is timeless underneath our world of a temporal world, what is eternal, what is absolute, underlying what is relative. And he uses this equivalently with truth, what is real, being, sometimes often God. Says God is truth. Truth is God, soul, self with a capital S, and many, many, many other terms. Now, for Gandhi, in his view of truth, which is different from most traditional philosophy, truth is something dynamic. He talks about truth force. Truth force. Truth is a force, in fact, the most potent force that is transformative. Right? Truth force, soul force, love force, God force. He uses these interchangeably. And truth is that force that we experience that allows us to bring together what is fragmented, what is chaotic, what is meaningless, into dynamic, interconnected, meaningful relations. Right? It brings meaning out of chaos and allows us to experience how we are part of that moral, social, cosmic, spiritual, meaningful whole. When it comes to ahimsa, and there are many, I might say one other thing I won't mention, there are many big questions and issues on all of this because Gandhi does believe in absolute truth. There are questions about that. But his major focus is on relative truth. So there are many questions about the relation between the absolute and the relative, especially for those who disagree with Gandhi on religious, scientific, skeptical, and other bases. Now, Gandhi, of course, Ahimsa, Gandhi is best known as the most influential proponent of nonviolence. Ahimsa, which from the Sanskrit, ahimsa refers to non-harm, non-injury, and is usually in English translated as nonviolence. Now, for Gandhi, in his approach to ahimsa, as opposed to, Gandhi is tremendously influenced by Jainism, and also he's a great admirer of the Buddha, and he's influenced by a lot of traditional Hindu scriptures on ahimsa, and he's also influenced by Western sources. But for Gandhi, most of traditional Indians and others on ahimsa are too passive. Simply avoid injury, avoid harm. For Gandhi, there's nothing passive about ahimsa. Ahimsa is the most positive force possible. It's the most active force possible for Gandhi. And in the work I've done on Gandhi, Gandhi greatly broadens and deepens our understanding of ahimsa, of nonviolence. Most people will freely say that they think that nonviolence is better than violence. Peace is better than war. Love is better than hatred, right? Kindness is better than cruelty. Justice is better than injustice. People readily grant that, although they'll usually qualify it and say, unfortunately, we live in a real world where we, in fact, have to use violence to achieve nonviolence. We have to have war in the name of peace, and so forth. We have to think about our ego self, this I, me, Doug Allen self, to get ahead economically, politically, academically, socially, simply because that's the kind of world in which we live. Okay? Now, Gandhi, of course, disagrees. Most of us who say that we do believe at least the ideal of nonviolence restrict this to examples of overt, usually physical violence. In other words, we say things like, we're against homicide, just killing, shooting people. We're against torture. We're against certain overt examples of overt terrorism, such as the Mumbai terrorism when I was there, and then spent a year right after that. We're against bullying. We're against rape. We're against domestic violence. Okay? Gandhi is against all of that. In fact, he was assassinated, right? In January 1948 by an act of overt physical violence. However, for Gandhi, overt physical violence is perhaps at most 10% of overall violence. So the way Gandhi broadens and deepens for us our understanding of violence, I've used two main concepts to do this. One is Gandhi refers to multidimensional violence. In addition to overt physical violence, we have psychological violence. We have inner violence. For Gandhi, hatred is violence, right? So if we carry all of this inner violence within ourselves, we are very violent people. That will come out in how we relate to ourselves and to others. Gandhi talks about, more than anything else, surprisingly, because he's such a great moralist and spiritualist, Gandhi talks the most about economic violence. Economic violence. This is, Gandhi says, the distinction between the economic haves and the have-nots. For Gandhi, poverty is violence. Gandhi usually equates economic violence with exploitation, this division between the haves and have-nots. Some people own and control the means of production, the land, the water, the resources, the labor of other people, the media, and the technology, and they are able to use their economic power to establish asymmetrical, hierarchical relations of domination over the overwhelming majority of have-nots. Gandhi talks about social violence, political violence, right? Cultural violence, religious violence, educational violence, environmental violence, linguistic violence. Language can be very violent. And Gandhi shows how all these different dimensions of violence interact and mutually reinforce itself in this kind of karmic, causal cycle. So we become entrapped in endless cycles of violence. The other key concept is what I've called the structural violence of the status quo. This is business as usual. Gandhi says that the economic system in India and the United States, when it is functioning smoothly, is structurally violent, systemically violent. Right now in the United States with Black Lives Matter and so forth, we're talking a lot about what Gandhi would have analyzed as the institutional, structural, systemic racism that shapes all of our life. Gandhi says when the political system is functioning smoothly, it is violent. When the dominant cultural system, the dominant consumerist media system is functioning, these are all violent. The fact that people may not be protesting, challenging through active nonviolence, organizing, mobilizing, resisting, that they accept their situation rather passively, does not render that less violent. Okay, so when you add the structural violence with the multidimensional violence and corresponding nonviolence, Gandhi really profoundly deepens and understands, deepens and broadens our understanding of violence and nonviolence. In that regard, Gandhi proposes his famous means-ends relationship that in all of his approach to philosophy and other thought. And so and Gandhi connects truth and nonviolence, satya and ahimsa, this way. Usually Gandhi says nonviolence is the means, the necessary means for realizing truth. Right? But sometimes Gandhi reverses this. Gandhi also says that nonviolence, that truth, living truthfully, speaking, acting truthfully, truth is also the necessary means for realizing nonviolence. Right? Love, compassion, selfless, and so forth. So, and in fact, in some other passages, Gandhi says that in fact, truth and nonviolence are simply two sides of the same coin. They're identical. They're convertible. In other words, truth and nonviolence refer to the one same reality. Sometimes we call it truth. Sometimes we call it nonviolence. But that expresses our human perspectives, how we want to regard reality. But in fact, they're two approaches, two philosophical approaches, two practices, two perspectives to the same unifying reality. Now, usually when Gandhi talks in his philosophy about means and ends, he's very famous for his moral, his ethical analysis, right? You cannot use immoral means in order to establish moral ends. Gandhi opposes what he thinks is our modern doctrine of the ends justify the means. And you can use any means possible in order to achieve your ends. Gandhi opposes that. You must use moral means, ethical means, if you want to achieve ethical ends. What is usually ignored is that Gandhi is also making a fundamental ontological point when it comes to violence and nonviolence, truth and untruth. So what Gandhi is saying briefly is, in this view, unifying view of the interconnected, the oneness of all unifies us at the most fundamental level, is more basic than what divides us by religion, by class, by ethnicity, by nationalism, or anything else. But this is a unity with a respect for differences. Gandhi would say, when you're acting violently, what does this mean? This means that your basic, fundamental, primordial concept is that what divides you from the other is most fundamental. In other words, in terms of white supremacy, we have so much in India and the kind of in the United States, but also kind of racism that I experienced over and over again that you find in different forms in India and other places. There's a fundamental category that the other person who is not white, or who is not a member of our religion, or is not a member of our ethnic group, is not a member of our caste, is not a member of our culture, is not a member of our true nationalism. The other is fundamentally other, right? This is a fundamental category. And it leads inevitably to devaluing, objectifying the other as less human, unethical, backwards, a threat, impure, right? And the need to control the other, often to destroy the other. So for Gandhi, when in fact we practice violence, we primordially, ontologically have a view of reality that the other is fundamentally other. We have that today, every day in the United States. The propaganda, the speeches, the actions, the policies that come out every single day from Washington as to who are the real Americans, basically white, Christian, right, and so forth, Americans, and the others, the immigrants, people of color, Muslims, Asians, migrants. They are not really the American. They are in some way fundamentally other. Similarly, Gandhi says in terms of his view of truth, ontologically, I'll simply say for Gandhi, the truth force, as the nonviolent force, is that force that brings us together, unites us, shows that in fact at the most fundamental level, what unites us and all of sentient life and existence in nature is more fundamental than what divides us, right? Untruthfulness does the exact opposite. In other words, when we act untruthfully, we act contrary to, we deny the underlying nature, ontological nature of reality. So this is a little bit of how I tried to approach Gandhi on the all levels, including the ontological. So let me say then in conclusion that for me, Gandhi is not only relevant for Gandhi 150 today, and for the future of India and the world, but more relevant than ever. For me, Gandhi-informed thought, philosophy, and practices are certainly relevant. indeed more relevant than ever in addressing our current crises of violence, war, conflict, hatred, divisiveness, exploitation, inequality, caste and gender, and racial and ethnic and religious oppression, imperialism and xenophobic nationalism, alienation and lack of human flourishing, economic and environment unsustainability. In my approach, and I think consistent totally with how Gandhi lived, Gandhi challenges us. Gandhi is always challenging us. Gandhi is always disturbing us. Some people simply want a Gandhi who, as in religion, who simply comforts us, right? Who reassures us that everything is okay. This is not Gandhi. Gandhi is constantly disturbing us. He even disturbed always his greatest allies in the Congress Party and others in India during the freedom movement. Gandhi is a catalyst. Gandhi is challenging us, right, to rethink our basic values, our thoughts, our ideas, our basic practices, how we live our lives, how we treat others. Gandhi is an indispensable catalyst, allowing us to rethink our positions, to grow, to develop. So what is needed now, in my view, is for us to engage Gandhi through creatively selective readings, interpretations, and applications, and through open-ended, dynamic, contextually relevant rereadings, reinterpretations, and reapplications. In doing this, we honor Gandhi and his legacy while we recognize that Gandhi does not have all of the answers, that Gandhi has not provided us with some fixed, absolute, perfect blueprint with the solutions to all of our crises. We must integrate our Gandhian approaches, perspectives, philosophies, and practices with complementary non-Gandhian approaches that have valuable insights with regard to contemporary crises focusing on class and caste, race and gender, religious and communal conflict, science and medicine and technology, and environmental sustainability. In my view, this is what is needed now, how we best address our contemporary crises and how we shall be able to provide positive, moral, nonviolent, truthful, Gandhi-informed alternatives. So I thank you for your attentiveness and patience, and I look forward now to your feedback, your comments. Feel free to express any disagreements. I always welcome disagreements, and I hope that we can have a lively discussion. Thank you very much.